Hello again, everybody. Today we're going to talk about nouns in English. Now, as I'm sure you already know, nouns are words which refer to people, places, or things. And depending on whether or not we can count a noun, we will separate it into both countable and uncountable. Literally, can be counted and cannot be counted. Now, there are a few rules for which is which. Sometimes it's obvious. For example, a ball or a car. Sometimes it's not. But we'll talk about a few ways that you can tell the difference and some tips and tricks that might help you distinguish the two further on in the lesson. Now, to begin, countable nouns exist in both singular and plural forms. For example, if I'm talking about houses, I can say a house, one house, or two or more houses. Likewise, if I'm talking about bikes, I can say a bike or one bike and two or more bikes. Now, to form the plural version of a countable noun, you need to add s or es to the end. Also, sometimes the ending vowel of a word may also change. And all of this is dependent upon the spelling of the word. But we'll go over the spelling rules in a little bit more detail later. Uncountable nouns, however, only exist in their singular forms. Now, let's look at some examples of what things are considered uncountable in English. First, food items like bread, meat, butter, cheese, etc. are all considered uncountable, and so are liquids. Tea, water, juice, petrol, coffee, as are materials, things like wool, silk, china, plastic, anything that something is made from. Also, abstract nouns, things like knowledge or information or advice, education, beauty, friendship, anything you cannot hold in your hand. And finally, there are some specific phrases that we also consider uncountable. Things like luggage, news, money. Now, if you want to describe the quantity of countable and uncountable nouns, you should remember the following rules. Only with countable nouns will we use the phrases a, many, few, or a few. For example, in the phrase a student, many students, few students, or a few students. With uncountable nouns, we use much, little, or a little. For example, much sugar, little information, or a little water. And finally, there are some phrases that we can use together with both countable and uncountable nouns. For example, the, some, any, no, a lot of, lots of, enough, and plenty of. All of these may be used with countable and uncountable. But earlier, I'm sure you heard me mention two very similar sounding phrases, few and a few, as well as little and a little. So let's review the difference between these two. For example, in the sentence, shall I buy some bread? Well, if I'm replying to this, I can say, it's not necessary. We have a little. Here we have enough. However, if I say there's little bread, will you go to the supermarket? I'm telling you that there is not enough bread, and I'm asking you, please go buy some more. Another example, if I say, Jake is quite shy, but he has a few friends. I'm saying here that, yes, Jake is shy, but he has enough friends. It's enough for him. However, if I say Ronnie was upset, few friends came to visit her, I'm saying that she is upset because not enough came to visit her. So remember that a little or a few is a good thing, whereas few or little, if we're talking about amounts, are bad things. Now, some uncountable nouns can also be turned into countable nouns by the use of some of the following phrases. For example, if I say a piece of, a slice of, a loaf of, a glass of, a cup of. Now these are all units or units of measurement. And whenever we add a unit, even uncountable nouns become countable. Now let's look at some example phrases where all of these are being applied. For example, if I'm using a piece of, I can say a piece of advice. Just one little piece of advice, or a piece of knowledge. Now, let's say I'm hungry and I want to talk about bread. I can say I want a loaf of bread, or if I'm not that hungry, a slice of bread. And finally, if we're talking about liquids, I can say maybe I don't just want some water, but I want a cup or a bottle of water, or a glass of water even. Now, as I promised earlier, we're going to examine some of these spelling rules of plural forms of countable nouns in English. Now, I'm sure you learned all of these in your first and second forms in school, so we're just going to review them generally. Starting off, I'm sure you remember that for nouns ending in S, a pair of S's, SH, CH, and X, add the ES ending. For example, a glass becomes glasses, a dish, dishes, a match, matches, and a box, boxes. Now, you should also note that for these endings, this is the only time that we will pronounce the es ending. Even if you see es in other cases, it will just be pronounced like the normal s ending. Moving on to a few more rules of spelling. Most of the nouns that end in O, we will also add es. For example, a potato turns to potatoes, and a buffalo turns to buffaloes. But be careful, there are some nouns that this is not true for. For example, a piano turns to pianos, just with an S, or a photo turns to photos, again, just with an S. Now, for nouns ending in Y, you will change the Y to an I and add ES. For example, in the words a butterfly to butterflies with IES, as well as cities. The city, C-I-T-Y, turns to cities with the IES ending. However, again, this rule is not always true. For example, words like toy becomes toys, just with the S ending. The same for monkeys. Monkey with a Y just adds S, monkeys. And boy turns to boys. You do not say Boise, you just say boys, B-O-Y-S. And the rule for this is that if there is a vowel, A, E, I, O, or U, before Y. If there is a consonant, Y to I and add ES. If there is a vowel, leave the Y as it is and just add S. Now, for nouns ending in F, we change the ending to VES. For example, a wolf becomes wolves. A knife becomes knives. A life, lives. A wife, wives. And a thief, thieves. Now, there are also some nouns for which the singular and the plural forms are the same. For example, a sheep is simply sheep. A deer is deer. A fish is fish. A trout is trout. And a salmon is just salmon. Now, you may be wondering, well, if it's the same form, then how do I tell the difference between the two? And the answer is simply this. If the word is preceded by, or another word comes before, if it is preceded by a number or an article, just something to indicate amount, then you know. For example, if you see two fish, you know it's two fish. Likewise, if you see a fish, you know it's just one. And there are also some words in English which have special plural forms. Article, just something to indicate amount, then you know. For example, if you see two fish, you know it's two fish. Likewise, if you see a fish, you know it's just one. And there are also some words in English which have special plural forms, and these you will need to memorize. For example, a man becomes min, and a woman becomes woman. Child becomes children. A mouse becomes mice. A louse becomes lice. A goose becomes geese. A tooth becomes teeth. An ox becomes the word oxen. A phenomenon becomes the word phenomene. A datum becomes the word data. And a series simply stays series. And since we're talking about nouns still, we should also mention the series data, the word data, and a datum becomes the word data, and a series simply stays series. And since we're talking about nouns still, we should also mention the possessive forms of nouns. For example, if I want to say the boy's jacket and my sister's bag, also the company's office, here I'm using a singular noun, so I just add apostrophe s. And this is really not dependent on the ending. For example, my name, which you all may not know, is Chris. Now, my name ends with an S, but the possessive form of my name is still Chris's. Chris, S apostrophe S. This is fine. Now, if we're talking about plural nouns, for example, the employees' cars, and the word ends with S, you will simply add an apostrophe, not apostrophe S. Employees, not employees'. However, if it's an irregular plural form, like children, you just add apostrophe S like normal. Now, you can also say things like the world's problems. Here, it doesn't have to be something that you know exactly what it is. It can be something big, just all of the world's problems, and you still use the same possessive form. Now, if you have two or more people or things that own something, for example, Suzanne and Jerry's son. In this example, the son belongs to both Suzanne and Jerry. However, we only made Jerry possessive because he is the last noun in the series. It's the same as if we're talking about Jenny and Gerald's house. Here, the house belongs to both Jenny and Gerald. However, we only made Gerald possessive. Now, I could switch the order and say Gerald and Jenny's house. It's only the last noun in the series. And finally, if we're talking about inanimate objects, we can also use the of construction. For example, the smell of the flowers, and the name of the museum, as well as the success of the company and the point of view. However, you should not use the of construction if you are talking about animate objects, about people. This construction, the of construction, is only about inanimate objects. Now, many set expressions also have phrases used in the possessive. For example, we were really frightened and embarrassed. We were at our wits' end. Here, wits is possessive. Or also, for God's sake, you are here. Now here, we've made God's possessive. And finally, he's a strange guy. You better keep him at arm's length. You don't want him too close to you. And here, again, we have made arms possessive. Now, this is all for the grammar rules involving nouns. Review this lesson once or twice because this is a very basic part of English. But it will keep you from making a lot more mistakes down the road. So I'll see you in the next lesson.